I'd like to welcome you to Mitigating the Risk, Digitalization of Stability Sample Management, presented by Novatek International and StabilityHub. And we have with us today Susan B. Cleary from Novatek, where she's Director of Product Development, Christopher Latoz, Stability Service Manager from Hollister Incorporated, and myself, John O'Neill, the PSDG Facilitator and Editor of StabilityHub.com. We're also joined by host panelist Walter Routh, founder of Sagana Consulting and associate editor at StabilityHub, and host panelist Jeff Carr, consultant and contributor to StabilityHub.com. We'd like to ask people if they would mute themselves if they're not invited to speak, and that you could ask questions at any point in time. Just use the chat feature. We'll see that and break in as soon as we can to get your questions answered. So without further ado, we'll introduce Susan and let her talk about the topic.
Hello, everybody. Happy almost Friday. So welcome and thank you for joining us. Today, the topics that we're going to cover are digitalization. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is digitalization. I have an IT background. Novatek designs LIMS systems and specifically stability management systems. So I get a lot of questions as an IT person about digitalization, what it is and what it can do. And we're going to talk a lot, of course, about the stability sample lifecycle and the phases, everything from creating an order, your study commitments, obtaining samples, authorization, control, management authorization, control over your process, sample movement, lifecycle, the chain of custody. We're going to talk about testing samples and, of course, finally disposing of samples when the testing is finished. And we're going to come with some conclusions. And, of course, these topics are all going to focus on the risks involved in these different phases of the life cycle and the remediation, how to remediate them using digitalization. And of course, we're going to be open to you guys asking questions to discuss the topics and talk about your own experience or ask questions about your own experiences when managing your stability studies, specifically the sample control. So what is digitalization? Of course, digitalization is much more than just digitization. Digitization, of course, is, you have things electronically. Your Excel sheet or your document, or entering a result in the cell of an Excel sheet. This is just digital information. But digitalization goes much further than that. It transforms the way you do business. It harnesses all the power of digital technologies to optimize your processes, increase efficiency, and of course, enhance decision-making. It leverages advanced analytics to analyze large volumes of data for quality processes. And of course, you can share your data and track it. And I like my little diagram on the right.
I'll break in for a moment and say we're not seeing your diagram yet. You need to go back to resharing your desktop if you would.
Yep, sorry. Let me. Did that work?
Yes, I was spellbound by what you were saying, so it didn't matter. But now it's even better.
Sorry, I'm just going to go back to there we go. Okay, so again, digitalization goes much further than just having an electronic record. On the right-hand side, now that you can see my diagram, are my Lego blocks, and of course, your Lego blocks are your data, and you see you have a big pile of data. But what digitalization does is supports, sorting it, arranging it, presenting it visually, and then finally explaining it with a story. So it's much more than just storing a pile of information somewhere. It's about getting meaningful information and meaningful use out of your data. So digitalization really is about evolving your process. It's not just about storing your data. And of course, digitalized data, centrally accessed data correlation, it's higher efficiency in data analysis, real-time monitoring and immediate notification of, let's say, outlier results. If you're putting in stability results and they're out of specification, the notifications, visual cues, email events, and so on. So really, again, digitalization is much more than just electronically storing your data. It's really about your productivity, your cost reduction, integration, interfaces with your equipment, and so on. Okay. So now that we kind of have an idea of what digitalization is, let's talk about it in regards to stability sample management. And of course, stability sample management comes along with a lot of risks, and these risks lead to sometimes very severe and negative consequences. Sample degradation, something happens to your sample, it degrades during storage to the point where you can't use it for testing. The consequence could be that you have to restart your study if you lose all your samples, which is, of course, a very severe consequence. Environmental fluctuations, so you get inaccurate, unreadable stability test results, potentially contaminated samples, sample loss, and of course, delay in testing. So, if you don't meet your requirement to pull out the samples at the proper pull window, if you're 3 month time point, you have to pull it out, give or take a few days, depending on how you've configured your study. So the risk again could be inaccurate, unreliable stability test results, testing delays, human error, of course, and the consequence, incorrect shelf life calculations, maybe leading even to releasing unsafe or ineffective products. There's many other risks involved with stability studies. I don't know, Chris, do you have some examples maybe of some of the risks with regards to your stability processes that you manage?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately in years past, we had some, poor sample management and, samples got disposed of prior to final time interval for a study, which, creates a lot of problems, as you can imagine.
Yeah. Anybody else have any experience with, negative consequence coming from something that happened with their samples?
For me, one of the things was the opposite of Chris's. Rather than the samples going early, we would hold on to them forever and ever at the request of various scientists throughout the organization, which eventually came to the recognition of people coming through for inspections, wondering how old things were. The last time we tested it, was it still on a protocol? And of course, they were done by then. And so trying to do favors by holding on to things for people just kind of backfired on us. That was a risk
Yeah.
for us.
Yeah, so there are a lot of risks, and of course the consequences resulting from that, the adverse events that happen with managing stability study samples. And of course, we're going to get into them with regards now to the life cycle of samples. And we did this in an article, of course. There's an article that matches with this presentation, and it talks about the sample life cycle, and we divided it up into 5 phases. Of course, the first phase is order creation. This is where you're looking at your manufacturing, looking for batch candidates, finding an appropriately manufactured batch for your study commitments. If you're doing bracketing, maybe you need very small packaging or very large packaging, or you need very very potent, the highest dosage or the lowest dosage if you're doing your bracketing. So really looking at how to get your samples. The other one is management authorization, of course, and this is permission controls, control over all the actions related to storing, testing, recording results, approving data, and using statistical analysis, who's allowed to do what, really controlling your process. And again, this is where digitalization can play a big role. With computerized systems now, you can have complete access control built in. And then sample movement, fully controlling all the sample movements, everything from setting it down, chamber management, when you're supposed to pull it, what's your pull window, transferring it to the different labs, whether it's chemistry or microbiology, for them to do their testing. Clearly documenting the sample's chain of custody, so its complete history of everywhere it's been, everything it's been used for. And then subdividing and testing. So a lot of times you'll open one sample and you can subdivide that to do multiple testing. So dispensing subdivided samples correctly while still maintaining the link between the aliquot and the whole sample. Also very important. And then, of course, exhaustion or destruction. When you're finished testing, when do you dispose of the samples? How do you dispose of them? How do you track that you've disposed of them correctly? Or the ones that you've used, how to track and account for those as well. So really the complete life cycle of everything from obtaining, setting down, using, transferring, and then disposing of the samples. Did anyone have anything to add about the different life cycle phases? No, we're good. Okay. Okay, so let's really start talking about risk and remediation, different phases of life cycle of the samples. And of course, we start at order creation. We have labeling errors, so incorrect sample labeling. It leads to confusion and errors in testing and data analysis. And this can result in inaccurate expiration dates being assigned to products. So barcode labels, of course, is something that is in every digitalized system now. I don't think we have, if you find a system that doesn't have barcoding on the labels, I think you're doing yourself an injustice. Barcodes can facilitate navigation through the system. So you scan a sample and you can navigate to go enter the result in the right place. You also need human readable information on your barcode label. So if something damages the barcode and it's no longer scannable, you want to be able to read that information and be able to type it into the system. You know, scanning is just a different way of inputting text. You're just scanning a barcode. Barcode is just a different font, just like Times New Roman or Arial. When you scan it, it just reads a different font through the scan and puts it in. So you need that human readable and you need the computer readable information on the labels. So that's very important. Sample degradation, of course, improper sample storage conditions, light exposure or chemical instability can cause samples to degrade prematurely, rendering them unsuitable for testing. And of course, you need inventory functionality to completely track your stability samples from cradle to grave, and it reduces the risk of a sample being stored in incorrect conditions. Does anyone have any examples of where samples were exposed to light inadvertently or there was some kind of degradation? When does this occur? Does anyone have any examples of that? Maybe John or Walter?
Yes, I do. One of our partners, when I worked at a particular company, was moving from one location to another. And of course, all the samples were taken out on carts and transferred to trucks and then taken over to the new site where as quickly as possible it went into new chambers. But they inadvertently sent a cart down the side hall and it was left there for several weeks. So while it looked like it was part of the study, it was a piece of the study that was left out and exposed to much different conditions. So I'm not sure where that happens. If it was checked out of one location and checked into another, then it would become obvious, I guess, that at that point the samples were missing. But without digitalization, and these were back several decades ago, the folks had no clue that the samples were missing until the inventory turned up that something was awry, and then they started working backwards to find where those samples went to.
Cool. Any other examples?
Yeah, we had a situation where a vial, well, our technicians were instructed to just store things based on the labeled packaging, which which is very non-digitalized, and the very small print on the packaging is the secondary packaging said to reduce exposure to light, and unbeknownst to us, the study was asked to be outside of that secondary packaging, unfortunately, and we didn't have a tracking system to prevent, to prevent the exposure that it got.
Yeah, exactly.
Susan, can I ask if there's a means if you have a very small package? I know this is a little bit outside digitalization, but it's something that would probably have to be dealt with in order to carry it on. Very small packages where you can't fit a label on the actual package. Is there a way that you can kind of refer the label to another spot or link it to the sample through somehow?
The most difficult labeling that I've ever seen was on a very small vial. And we actually had to make the label, 1 inch by a ½ inch and have a very, very small barcode on it. And unfortunately, in that case, we were able to label it with a barcode. Unfortunately, in that case, we were not able to label it with the human readable information. It's simply a matter of not having enough real estate on the label. So what we did was we created box labels. So the samples can sit in an open box, so they're not closed in or anything to interfere with, the conditions, the conditional requirements of the study with regards to temperature or humidity.
Mhm.
And the box was labeled and the samples were kept individually in there. So that's one way that you can address having very tiny products that you have to store and then subsequently test.
Thank
And
you.
another example that I've seen is when samples are stored in one facility and tested in another, and they have to be transported to a different location. And of course, many times when this happens, you have to put them in a mobile chamber, if you will, and they still have to be maintained. If they're going to travel for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 days, they have to be maintained in that storage condition. So you want to make sure that if that's the case, you have a system that'll let you track the location of where it's being transferred from, where it's being transferred to put equipment in the transportation device to monitor the storage conditions. If it has to go on an airplane and then it's stored at a very cold temperature, or if it's very hot on the tarmac in hotter places like India, for example. So that's another place where you want to have digitalization to support the transport of samples from one facility to another, and thus ensuring that they're not adversely affected by conditions during transport. So another one, of course, sample storage conditions. Storing conditions in stability chambers that are not tightly controlled or monitored, causing premature sample degradation. So you want to make sure your chambers are connected to your digitalized system and that you're getting warnings or alarms if they fall outside of their margin of error. So, 35 degrees plus or minus 2, for example. And as soon as it goes out of that range, some warnings should flag to you to tell you, hey, this chamber is fluctuating a little bit too much. And of course, there's always human errors. Mistakes made by personnel involved in sample management can lead to errors in expiration date determination. So human errors, setting it down in the wrong storage condition, inventory control is, I think, one of the most important things when you're digitalizing your stability process. And of course, carryover sampling handling alerts from manufacturing to the stability group, track sample placement into holding locations. So when the production people give you your samples, they should be required to verify at the beginning that there was no compromise in the storage conditions of the samples. Does anyone have any other examples of risks when you're creating your studies, when you're ordering your samples or setting them down? No?
Maybe a question about that was similar to the one where the cart got misplaced. If you have samples that you pulled out of a chamber and then somebody is about to put it back into the wrong chamber, I would imagine there's some kind of a barcoding thing you could do of going in and out, whereas if you tried to barcode your way into a wrong location for your particular sample, say at 25 degrees going into a 40-degree chamber, there might be some kind of a way to alarm that by way of barcodes or some kind of sensors.
Yeah, absolutely. Just again, going back to the barcodes and labeling of samples, historically, when we had linear barcodes, remember they were all lines? For those of us that are old enough to not remember a time when there was no data matrix or QR codes and so on. The linear codes, they are created, the numeric sequence is created based on identity fields in a database. So the location has an identity, the chamber, for example, chamber 1 at 25 degrees, and that identification is a number in the database. And what we do is we embed that in the barcode. So when you scan the barcode, the system you're scanning it into will automatically know that it's this batch number, this related to this study, and it was stored in this conditions and in this chamber. And of course, the system automatically should pop an error. If you're trying to transfer it back into a chamber where it does not belong, then of course the system should pop an error to you and say, no, you're putting that in the wrong chamber, please correct it. And it blocks the action. So absolutely, barcodes can really achieve a lot nowadays. And now more so with the QR codes and the data matrix, instead of it just being, a series of numbers, there's much more information that we can now embed in these barcodes about these samples. So really leaps and bounds have been made over the last 20, 25 years with regards to using automation, digitalization, and scanning of barcodes and QR codes.
I had a question, although before I pose it, I just want to remind all the participants, you guys can feel free to pose any questions in the chat. I'm checking for those, and we'll try to get you in as we can. But the question I had is just regarding the order creation. Is something that really bugs me is that when creating a study in our LIMS system, we're often transcribing a lot of data from, a lot of information, the test data, all this from multiple systems around, and putting that data into our stability LIMS. It just seems like a big waste of time when all those systems could be connected somehow. So do you foresee the capability of a digitized system to extract that information automatically? How do you overcome the different data formats and all that between the systems?
So that is a feature that does exist, by the way. Yes, you can pull over from your finished products release system the information directly into your zero time point. You have the option, of course, if you've set down the samples within a certain period of time of them being produced, then you're allowed to use your your finished products certificate of analysis as the zero time point data, and you can pull it over. Now, speaking just about Novatek, we do have that feature. We also have a finished products module where you pull the information over automatically, and it keeps it consistent with regards to any calculated values, equations, and so on. But I mean, this can happen with any system. Taking Novatek aside, any of the good systems out there are going to support integrations through APIs. And when I say API, I mean application programming interface, not active pharmaceutical ingredient. It's a technical term that explains a piece of software or a tool that you use to facilitate communication of data between two systems. So absolutely, you want to be able to automate that just in the same way you'd want to be able to automate bringing data over from your HPLC, your chromatography systems. You want to automatically, as much as possible, bring in your data because that enhances your compliancy, it enhances your data integrity. So definitely good question. And yes, this is something that you should have at order creation, is the availability of those results, and preferably automatically transferred. Okay. Any other questions for order creation?
Just a comment, not really to do with digitalization, but to help, mitigate the risk of human error, especially when you're, counting samples, charging them into the chambers to, initiate the study. It's a good idea if you have the resources to have a secondary person, confirm that, the correct quantity, correct product, correct lot number is being charged into the correct chamber. So just, I think it's a really good practice.
Yeah, there's even features that exist that if your stability system calculates how much inventory you need. Let's say you have 3 different storage conditions. You're using your zero time point, so you're using your finished products results. So you don't need your zero time point testing. So you zero out the quantity you need at that point. Once the system calculates everything that you need, there's features that force you to scan in each individual sample. So each individual sample is uniquely identified, and you have to physically scan in each sample to initiate the study. So digitalization can be as strict as that. And I have seen that particular way of doing things done at a company that I won't name, but they were under consent decree. And this was one of the things that they were required to do because there was so much. Anyway, they had so many problems with the FDA that finally the FDA put their foot down and they said, no, you have to do this. So there was modifications made where the strictness of controlling the samples was increased to a very dramatic point. So in some cases that is required. I wouldn't say that's needed in all cases, but things like that can exist or do exist and can be used in extreme cases where it's needed.
We have a chat question that came in regarding monitoring stability chambers and what kind of systems do that. I got the impression that this is underneath the level of digitalization, more in the digitized area, and they had issues with chambers overnight, not noticed until employees returned in the morning. There are a number of good systems out there that will detect that and then trigger a notification system, both in-house to security and even to employees at home. Whoever's been put in charge of monitoring for the evening will get a notice on their computer, or else their phone will go off with a recorded alarm. Those kind of things. I've been a recipient of those. So those systems do exist. Couldn't tell you the name of one right now, but Susan, did you have any comment on that particular question?
No, just to echo what you said. Yes, there's many systems out there now that monitor these chambers 24/7, and they have notifications by email. There's many different ways you can get notifications. Audible alarms in the facility. Email notifications. So there's lots of ways to handle this. And I'm sure if you go to ChatGPT nowadays and type in, I need a system to monitor my chambers overnight, you're going to get a laundry list of all different companies that can provide that service. Okay. All right. So next phase was authorization, access controls, management authorization. So security risks, of course, unauthorized access to samples or test data can compromise the integrity of the testing process and security of confidential information. So of course, digitalized systems, we've all seen it, permission controls, right? User management, access controls built in. You want to have a role-based system, so you can create a role and then assign many users to that role. You're going to have different people, there are different groups of people doing different activities in the system. So role-based is usually the best way to do it. And of course, you need user activity and audit trail. This is, of course, mandatory for any GMP data. And of course, stability study management falls under that category of GMP data. And then regulatory compliance. Failure to comply with regulatory requirements for stability testing can lead to product recalls, fines, and other legal consequences. So you have to manage your sample inventory well as your testing results. They have to be in a validated system, 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, Annex 11 compliant. You also have to consider data integrity as well. So, I find the regulations really evolved over the last 20 years again, starting out with just managing your electronic records. And now regulatory, says data integrity, make them reliable. If you're looking at the next iteration of regulations that are come out, they're encouraging more and more use of the records that you've been storing. So really regulatory compliance, very important to have a digitalized system to meet with those regulations. And then, of course, human mistakes made by personnel entering data erroneously into a stability study management system. And management does not catch the error and authorizes the sample or data. So link manufacturing and stability systems to minimize transcription of sample or material information. And the stability study management system can flag, transcribe manually entered information. Again, going back to using barcodes, scanning in samples to make sure you go to the right place to enter the data. And as much as possible, link your equipment to your system. I think this is one of the most important things nowadays on your path to digitalization, because it's so much better to pull in all the information, whether it's from your HPLCs, your balances, your pH meter, whichever equipment you're using. As much as possible, you want to be able to pull in the information. And of course, for management authorization, having sequential steps in the system. This is actually from 21 CFR Part 11. Sequential steps are met. So for example, if you had to start an investigation, that the investigation is completed before you can review the results. Or if it's out of specification, a visual indication is made in the system, and an email is sent out to the appropriate people on a distribution list. So really overseeing everything, having management log in and being able to easily access, through a nice dashboard, how many investigations are going, how many OOS samples do I have, how many approvals are outstanding, and so on. So I think a dashboard would be a good way to describe how to remediate some of the risks of management authorization. Any other examples from anybody?
Pet peeve of mine was when there was a need in the middle of the night, say on the second or third shift in the analytical lab, and they run out of sample. They contact some manager for authorization, somebody who has the authorization to change something in limbs or allow a change in limbs. And the manager wakes up in the middle of the night, he gives permission, then he goes back to bed. Samples get pulled out, and the stability group is none the wiser until they do an inventory. So it's so easy for somebody to get authorization to change the count in limbs or authorize the removal of samples. So training people and also limiting authorization is very helpful to make sure that we don't get any accidentally approved withdrawal of samples that are going to short the study. Happens a lot, and you wouldn't expect it.
Another thing that I've seen with regards to entering results and changing your protocols is the 4 eyes practice, or even 6 eyes. Having those sequential steps where you have to enter in the information, and then you enforce that the person who entered it cannot be the person who reviews it, and then the person that reviews it cannot be the person who does the approvals. So you want to have 4 eyes or 6 eyes practice built into your digitalized solution, or even into your manual solution, wherever it is. You always want to have multiple people reviewing and checking the data. And that's all the data throughout the system, not just the results, but also, protocols, inventory, pullouts, and so on. Okay. Any other questions for authorization and access control?
I had a question from a different source here that it seems nearly every keystroke within a digitalized system would have to be audit trailed in some way. So what kind of risks or challenges come with such an extensive database? I mean, it's like...
I really like that question, actually. This is a good one. So, okay, when we talk about digitalization, okay, and audit trails. So the garden variety systems that are out there right now, when you enter data in the system, then you would hit save, you enter in your reason, and you put in your password. And your password is the second component of your electronic signature. Okay. But the newer systems, what we're working on now, are systems that autosave. So as you're typing, the system records everything you do. So it's just like a piece of paper. When we all had our paper back then, we would write down, and if we wrote down something, we had to cross it out and date it and initial it, good document practices, right? So the newer digitalization approaches now are that if you type it in, it records it. And then if you remove it, it records that you removed it or changed it. And all of this is called autosave. And yes, it's auto recording certain areas. So now we don't do it on all the data in the system. We're not going to do that, let's say, on registrations and so on, but we focus on the electronic laboratory notebook where you're actually putting in information during the execution of an analytical method, and we do it on the results entry areas. We don't have to do it, for example, on the data that's coming from equipment. Of course, the equipment's not going to change anything. It sends it over. But if somebody changes it after the equipment has transmitted it and the transaction is finished, then yes, that would be recorded. And again, it's called autosave. And that's also something you should start looking to have in your systems where there's significant risk. And again, for stability, for me, that's in the electronic laboratory notebook area where you're executing, and also in your results entry area as well. So very good question to relate to digitalization and the current solutions that are available to everybody. Okay. Any other questions for management authorization? No? All right, so sample movement, risk and remediation. So missed or late samples, okay, sample is missed, pull is missed, or the sample is pulled from the chamber outside the due date window. So email notifications, of course, help. from Stability Study Management System when samples are due to be pulled. And of course, usually it's a pull window. The thing I most commonly see is you have an interval due date, which is calculated based on your 0 time point, and then 3 months, 6 months, 9, 12, 18, and so on. And then you have a buffer. So plus or minus 2 or 3 days is the most common that I see. And that allows for accounting for weekends. So you don't have to come in on Saturday and Sunday and pull your samples. You can pull it on the Friday, or you can pull it on the Monday. You need visual cues when you log into the system. This is one of the things that I've seen. Before you're allowed access to the system, a report pops up right in front of you, or a window or a grid pops up right in front of you and says, okay, these are the samples that have to be pulled today, and these are the samples that are late. So visual cues on logging in indicating which samples are ready to be worked on. That's very important. Also during sample movement, loss of samples. Some people may misplace samples or lose them, leading to testing delays, potential inaccuracies in expiration date calculations. So of course, barcode labeling for system samples. It allows scanning samples in and out of chambers. So if you take it out, you have to scan it out. If you want to put it back, you have to scan it back in. A good example of controlling this for weight loss samples. Weight loss samples are some samples that they're not like the regular ones that get destroyed, or exhausted at each time point after they're pulled out. They're used for testing for your, 3 months or 6 months, and then they're disposed of or destroyed during testing. Weight loss, you have to keep putting them back. So imagine being able to scan out your weight loss, and then the system lets you scan it back in to the next interval. So you've done your weight for 3 months, and it forces you to scan it back into your 6 month to log it in there. So really having good control, using the barcodes and having that human readable on your label, and also a robust chain of custody with sample possession and status tracking. So you should have something that says, okay, Susan has this sample and she's using it for, an assay for the chemistry department, for example. And you want to have a history. So when I'm done, if I go and, I go to dispose of it, then I have to go to the system and tell the system, well, I destroyed that sample on this date and so on. So really significantly tracking your samples to make sure that you don't lose them, very important. And always being able to go back and look at the history to see where they were. And of course, human error, people misplace samples. There's no record of sample handoff and transfer. And again, that goes to having that robust chain of custody built in, that anybody that has a sample has to take possession of it electronically in the system. And then they have it physically. And that way, where that sample was when it went missing. So you have some accountability. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there's a lot more. This is one of the biggest risks, I think, is when humans have to go obtain these samples and work on them. And, you factor in that human error and a lot of things can go wrong. So I'm sure many people have examples. So I don't know, John or Chris, do you guys want to throw in some there?
Some examples, but perhaps we go back to the chat questions for a moment. Was there any risks of interference to labels with barcodes under high temperatures and relative humidity chamber conditions for their impact on their readability? So I guess we're asking if we're using water labels that could be runny or soaked or anything, or is there a way to combat that by using some kind of waterproof things?
Okay, so a couple of solutions for that. So one of them, and again, this goes to, what are your storage conditions? What is your relative humidity? Most of the time I see people using thermal transfer, not direct thermal, but thermal transfer with the ribbon. And this is not like direct thermal. Direct thermal is like your receipt from the grocery store. After time, it's going to fade, so you don't want to use that. The thermal transfer from the ribbon will remain on it, so those are a really good solution in most cases. Now, I have seen some companies where they'll print the label, and then they have a plastic that they go over the label with. So they have the regular label, and they cover it with the plastic, and that's if they're going to store it, let's say, at a high humidity, like 75% or something. And there are other labels where you don't even have to do the plastic on top. And of course, they're a bit more expensive, but you can purchase those. And then those are guaranteed to not fade, even if you wipe them with like isopropyl alcohol I'm aware of that. I know maybe you're not going to do that with stability samples, but we do also have systems for environmental monitoring where that's required for controlled areas and clean rooms. So the media, when I say media, the label rolls or the label sheets are out there that can support this, of course. Okay. Did that answer the question, I hope?
Sounds like it did. And going back to your original question about the examples of things, one of the bugaboos I've seen is that we might carefully track our stability samples into our chambers, make sure we monitor them, and then carefully track the transition over to the analytical lab. It might be a good way that we should go is to also have official stations in the analytical lab, even if it means on the counter, some kind of way to log it in there to make sure that it hasn't entered something like a refrigerator where it might not supposed to be, or a freezer. We might want to make sure that we keep it at room temperature. So putting some kind of a station login when it comes to the far end of the process would be a good idea as well. We can't track everything just in stability and then turn it over and have everything just go south on us at that point because we didn't follow the entire process.
Yeah, exactly. Having a central place to maintain the samples, and at that place having a computer, whether it's a laptop or a computer embedded in the wall or what have you, but having the ability to log in and say, okay, I've put the sample here. Susan put the sample here Monday at 2 p.m. and this is how I'm storing it. More and more we should look at ways of moving away from paper, and part of achieving that is making sure that the hardware to access the system is readily available in all the correct places. You want to make it as easy as possible for your personnel to be able to log in and enter the information about what's going on with that sample. So having computers, in strategic locations throughout your facility is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, in the absence of another chat question, I had a question out from external sources. Right now, when a physical sample is delivered, it involves a physical entry and signature. So the normal paper log. So that process has been well received by inspectors for forever. So it seems to maintain a spot. You can see missing lines and such if someone forgot to log in a sample. So how is a digitalized system going to be more robust than a good old standard sample log?
So a sample log is paper-based. And, after a while, that piece of paper is going to get full, and paper doesn't support filtering. You have to go backtrack through all of the different log entries. So, and searching for that specific sample. Digitalization would let you scan in a barcode and then it would show the complete history of that sample. That's part and parcel of a chain of custody feature, is seeing the sample's transaction history. Now, it is easier maybe in some cases because it's easier to write it down because you have to log into the system, go to where that entry has to be done, make the entry, and then save it. So the input might take a little bit longer than writing it down on that piece of paper, but the output is where you get the value because you can easily find the sample, look at the history of that sample, compare it to the history of other samples. Maybe if something went wrong with that sample, did it go wrong with any other samples as well? It's good for root cause analysis during investigations when you have to look at that information. And of course, it's much easier to find this critical information about the control of the sample during the investigation. So I guess I understand, writing it down on a piece of paper is easy, but having that data at your fingertips when you're doing these investigations is important. And I always like to tell everybody, they ask, well, what's my critical data? And I say the critical data is the data you don't have when you're doing an investigation. Mm-hmm. So I guess for me, that's where you gain with the digitalization solution instead of writing it down on a piece of paper.
Just a timekeeping note, we have about 15 minutes left in our session.
Okay, let me
And
Sorry, go
further
ahead.
answer to that, though, in relation to the investigation part of that, you know, the fact is that an investigator, when they go into a lab area to inspect, if they see a logbook, they're going to look at it and they're going to look for problems with it. So when you don't have a logbook, it's all digitalized, then you don't have that risk, first of all. And if they do need to see sample chain of custody, like you said, they can just pick any sample and you can show them by filtering, you can show them exactly where that sample has been, who logged and who delivered, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, that's you bring up a good point. When the regulator is doing an audit, let's say, we're seeing more and more now with our client base that the auditors are asking users to log into the system and show them the process in the system, how it's done, show them the data directly in the system. This for me is becoming a standard practice now with the auditors. And whichever system you're using, you want to make sure that you have expert support readily available. So we actually have our clients call us and notify when there's going to be an audit, and then we put them on a priority list. So when they contact us during that audit, that we'll respond to them very, very quickly to make sure that they can respond to the auditor any question that they're not able to answer themselves. So and that's something that can be offered by people that offer the digitalized solutions. So very good point. Okay, so subdividing testing. So product recall, if a product is found to be unstable or ineffective due to errors in stability testing, it may need to be recalled, which can be costly, damaging to the company's reputation. And of course, trend regression analysis functionality in the stability study management systems allows users to see out of trend or out of specification results that may require investigation. So when you're doing your testing, you want to see right away through visual cues, through emails, if you enter an out of spec value, or even if you enter a value that's out of trend. And one of the things I see is in stability, you want to know if your result is varying 5% difference from, let's say, the previous time points result. There's a 5% variation, then you want to be notified. That's one way to determine out of trend and stability. And of course, all of that should be automated, so you see it right away and you can act on it right away. Missed test date window, again, that goes to sample movements, but samples stored for too long awaiting testing after being removed from the chamber. So they pull it out for testing and then they don't actually do the testing for quite some time. So email notifications from the stability study management system when testing needs to be initiated, and visual cues and pop-up messages on logging into the system indicate which results are due to be entered. So it's not only notification about pulling the samples, it's notification about where my results are to make sure that the testing was actually done. And data integrity, directly interfacing with your laboratory instrumentation. I'd already spoken about that. That's one of the most beneficial things you can do with regards to digitalization is integrate your devices and automate the data transfer. Another one is calculating. A lot of companies I see have these Excel sheets that are locked down or whatever to do these calculations that they need to do. Your digitalized solution should provide you a formula builder, an equation builder with a validation in the system, and that way you do all your calculations automatically. And you can even import data from equipment directly into where the calculations get done. So it can go to an equation variable or directly as a system result. Data loss, of course, accidental deletion or data loss due to system failures or human error. And again, prompt before data deletion, deleted data is still retrievable and restorable via audit trail, of course. Once you're in a digitalized system, that's validated, 21 CFR Part 11, Annex 11, and so on, there's no risk of you losing your data. And again, going back to the autosave. So auto-saving your data as you go, so there's zero risk of losing any data whatsoever. Subdividing as well, being able to take out a partial of a sample. Let's say you're testing a bottle of 100 tablets, for example, being able to open it and take out 10 of those tablets, or 24 of those tablets, let's say, to do some dissolution testing. And of course, you want to be able to label the aliquot to make sure that you can relate it back to the original sample where it came from. So also very good ways digitalization has to remediate the risk during subdividing and during testing. Another good one is having an embedded electronic laboratory notebook with method steps built in. Instead of having to go access your SOP, all the steps are in front of your user, and they can execute and enter this confirmation of validity criteria during each step and completing each step electronically in the same system where the results are going to be housed. Anyone else that has some examples of risks of subdivision or testing that's been remediated? No, we're good? Okay. Then finally, we get to exhaustion and destruction. Human error, accidental disposal of samples from the wrong study, waiting too long to dispose of samples from a study and not complying with SOPs, accidental disposal of samples from a study before completion of testing, and of course, barcode labeling, tracking from cradle to grave, along with secondary verification and confirmation. So again, the 4 I's practice, somebody has to go and verify before you actually execute the operation, and making sure that you're scanning as you're removing them, and if you scan the wrong sample and it's still undergoing testing, the stability study is still active, then it shows you a message and says, no, this is from an active study, don't delete it or don't dispose of it. And of course, sample loss, so equipment failure, catastrophic events, fire, flood, earthquake, hurricane, stability samples can be lost or destroyed, preventing completion of the study. A contingency plan should be in place to address these potential issues, and redundant sample storage at a secondary remote location mitigates the impact of a catastrophic event. And stability study management allows for dual inventory of tracking the samples placed in a redundant storage, and sample information and test results are stored on a redundant server or cloud. The sample loss for the contingency samples, I don't think you need to put it on a secondary cloud. You could, but it might not be required. You can store the amount of extras that you have with a study. We'd consider those extras. So you have your core samples that you're going to use, and then you have a buffer amount of samples, whatever that is, and those are stored offsite. And of course, that would definitely assure that there's no risk to losing the samples if they're stored somewhere else. Any other comments? Or I have one more actually. It's based on something John mentioned earlier. Having a notification after a study is finished, it's completed and you've closed the study, and you get a notification saying, okay, well, you have 30 samples left in chamber A, and that's notified when you log into the system. You see it right away. So you can clean out your chambers. We've had some clients come back and tell us, we needed a feature to tell us where we have these extra samples so we can clean them out because we ran out of space in our chambers. So you want to know what you can go take out and what you can leave or what you need to leave in. So again, chamber management, for your samples is also very important. So any other examples? Okay. This one question. Sorry, I'm just reading the chat. Was there any questions in the chat?
There's one follow-on from Walter, but we have about 5 minutes left, so we could maybe take that at the very end if we've gotten through everything.
Okay. So just, we've looked at all the risks and remediation, using digitalization. So how does process control and digitalization benefit me in relation to sample management? And of course, meeting your stability study commitments, both pre and post market, being able to calculate how many samples you need, making sure the samples are well controlled, complete chain of custody from order to destruction. Okay, calculating how many you need, you set down, calculating your extras that you need, and maintaining that, and not, ensuring that it's destructed at the right time, not, not before the study is done and shortly after the study is done. So it reduces your risk through sample control and access control, and it reduces the risks through digitalization. There's data control, enhanced reporting, automatically calculating your shelf life, your p-value analysis, your Arrhenius equation, all of the statistics that are dedicated for stability studies, having specialized out of trend tools to show you, and compare across all these different studies to show data that could be potentially out of trend, not just based on a percentage. Regulatory compliance, efficiency, and of course, faster time to market. And the last one, of course, the best one, no FDA citations, which is always one of the best benefits. So just again, closing off on, digitalization, how do you prepare for digitalization? So these are the 7 steps. Identify your objectives clearly, write a user requirement. How do I, what features do I need to enhance my process? Focus on those requirements, establish the new processes in line with digitalization. So you select a system that provides, 95% of your user requirements. Maybe you can proceduralize around the other 5%. And then choose your technology wisely. Make sure that even if some of the requirements, you're not going to put them in place right away, that the system can grow and provide the functionality to meet with those requirements that you might be putting in a second phase. Restructure to accommodate your change, of course, execute your plan, and then allow space for agility. You have to have time to adjust to digitalization. It's a process change and there's people involved. So you have to give them time to adjust to the new process, the changes, and of course, then repeat the steps for the next objectives. So, maybe if we take it into consideration of stability, maybe you want to have chamber management and sample tracking. And then later on, you want to incorporate, let's say, an electronic laboratory notebook. So again, do it piece by piece. Rome wasn't built in a day, and laboratories really don't become paperless overnight. I find the best approach is iterations to really move to digitalization instead of a big bang. It's much more easy to deal with. And your function can be gradually enhanced by following that process. Okay, thank you very much. And just to say, automation can enforce processes. So you can fix processes, you can fix systems, and you can fix procedures, but can you really fix people's habits without automation? And having automation as a tool to tell the user what to do and to ensure that the user does the right thing through these sequential checks is really great for efficiency and enhancing your processes for stability studies. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I'm just scanning to see if there's any more questions. Walter had gotten answers to the ones he listed. I think one is similar to one I had about pulling systems together where they might be old system versus a new system, trying to put all that information into a new report. Trying to go from one old LIMS system to another one's always been a problem, but it sounds like with digitalization, you could capture the data and still have the original formats to compare just going into a report.
Yeah, we have migrated data from an existing legacy LIMS into another one. As long as the data is of a consistent format, then we can grab the data and move it over. And of course, that has to be taken on a case-by-case basis, depending on what they're currently using to move over the data. Some companies are on like file-based systems, which it's almost impossible to move that over. And what they do usually in that case is they'll enter in all of the data for stability studies that are less than a year. Anything greater than a year or a year and a half, then they'll keep it on the old system until it fizzes out, until they start just using the new one. Mm-hmm. And they archive it. So there's different ways to handle moving from an old LIMS to a new system. So, and again, it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. We need to close out. I'll make a note that Walter brings up a point that we might be saving some headcount and resource money by using digitalization in a whole lot of different ways. So perhaps that might be covered in a future webinar. I'd like to thank Susan and Novatek for bringing us this particular session. They will return again, I think, in April for yet another one in this series. But the next up for StabilityHub webinars is February 19th. We'll be celebrating Stability Day with a 90-minute session where you can bring your own questions, and we'll have a panel to give you the best possible answers. We'll have some, believe it or not, stability stories to tell, and in general, just celebrate the day. February 19th for Stability Day. And then in March, a session from Parameter Generation and Control on stability chambers. You can find all this information and how to link into these webinars if you go to stabilityhub.com and go to the events section. So with that, we'll close out our day and thank you all for joining us and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.